And good evening and welcome everyone to night 4 of Plenary Tracker, bringing you news and insights from the Plenary Council from the Australasian Catholic Coalition for Church Reform and Concerned Catholics, Canberra-Goulburn. My name's Genevieve Jacobs. It's good to be with you again from the lands of the Ngunnawal people, whose elders and traditional ownership I acknowledge, and the elders of the places from whence you join us. This evening's all about debate, wholehearted engagement. It's great to see that happening in the comments every night. Please post your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen through our moderator, Andrea Dean, who's with us tonight. And please let's have respectful engagement. Ask questions that truly take us somewhere useful. Be robust, be critical, but ask something meaningful. James is our technical administrator, so you can message him through the Q&A screen if you're experiencing any difficulties. Tonight, a discussion on governance in the church, a key underlying theme for many of the issues that challenge the Australian church, whether regarding the role of women and marginalised people in the church, the voice of victims, or the consequences of the Royal Commission, and of course a major focus for reform groups in the lead up to the Plenary Council. So today, how is the church run, who's running it, and what needs to be done differently? But first, what happened today in the Council? And we have news. Now, any major changes in the current Assembly of the Plenary Council will have to wait until next year to be voted on, according to the President of the Council, Archbishop Tim Costello. The Archbishop today outlined a process to treat any views from this week's virtual meeting as proposals and not formal motions. They'll come in 9 months' time at the second Assembly after careful vetting for orthodoxy and conformity with the laid down protocols. But already the 278 members of the Assembly, outnumbering the 46 bishops who have the final deliberative votes, are beginning to find their voice. The report back of the 10 groups showed an emerging consensus for change and for lay men and women to be heard and not ignored. One group made a point of the bishop's poor form in this regard. Dr. Nimi Kandappa said that her group thought they were being asked to reinvent the wheel as 2 reports commissioned by the bishops, Light from the Southern Cross and Woman and Man, were disregarded with no accountability. A highlight of the open session was a contribution by the Australian theologian, Father Richard Lennon, beamed in from Boston. He said that as a church, we have no option but to exist in our present. This is where we are. This moment of history is where God is. And he said we have to sniff out the presence of God in the world and celebrate it. Another group thought the challenge was not to bring people back to the church so much as to take the church to where the people are. Tomorrow, the plenary will go completely dark to the outside world when members discuss how the church might heal the wounds of abuse, coming to see through the eyes of people who have been abused. And they'll also discuss how the church might meet the needs of the most vulnerable people. In his blog from the plenary, John Warhurst says he's feeling an increasing sense of urgency to move forward at a more deliberate pace. He says others in the Assembly he's spoken to share his concern, with one woman delegate telling him she feels they may have taken a step backwards. In his blog, Francis Sullivan is more positive, though he says the heat is on to craft some tangible proposals that will be accepted next year, even if they call for amendment or change to church positions. Francis says tomorrow the plenary needs to speak loudly and compassionately to those whom we know have been victims. Actions, he says, speak louder than words. And on that, both our local delegates have issued a call at today's Assembly for the Plenary Council to endorse the Uluru Statement from the Heart and for dioceses and parishes to establish reconciliation action plans. Many of you will know all about RAPs, as they're called, from your own workplaces and organisations. And John and Francis have described the call as a declaration of vital importance to equity and faith in Australia, demonstrating that we in the church want to be in tune with the spirit of the country and its creator and with the aspirations of our First Nations people. So let's see where that goes. But let's go now to our first guest this evening. Our Plenary Council member of the day is Helen Belcher. Helen's co-chair of the Council for Mission and a member of the Synod Working Party in the Maitland-Newcastle Diocese. She's a retired academic and a former councillor on the Council for Australian Catholic Women. Helen, wonderful to have you with us. We're hearing a great deal about synodality. First, just give us a clear definition of what that actually is and what the concept means for mission and for governance. I think you might be muted, Helen.
Sorry, I've been used to that all day today. Thank you very much. Thank you for your welcome. Just before I answer, could I just say that I'm speaking from Wonnarua land on the Hunter Valley in New South Wales, and I acknowledge them, their elders, and their future. What does synodality mean? Simply for me, synodality means walking together, journeying together, listening to the voices of everyone, lowly and high. It's a pilgrim journey, and I think that this probably underpins the idea of Jesus' mission and hence informs the idea of governance. Can I just say, though, one of the things I'm particularly interested in structures and governance, and I have been a lot for quite a significant amount of time. But one of the things that I came to in reflecting on what questions I would put my name down for the actual plenary assembly, I came to the realisation that there is a fundamental need for conversion, a renewal of the life and the mission of the church. So I ended up electing to go into one of the groups that was dealing with the question of personal and communal conversion, but also ecclesial and ecological conversion. So for me, unless you actually have a real understanding of what the purpose is, what the mission is, what the spirit is, then the structures and the governance systems that we set in place, well, they won't work. So, and I wanted to be informed by my participation by the wider community. And that's in our own diocese has included 6 weeks of plenary conversations leading up to the assembly. So I think it's really important. We need to be journeying and we need to actually be talking to everyone.
I think, Helen, much of what we've discussed in our plenary tracker sessions so far also relates to subsidiarity, the principle that all people have the right to participate in decisions that affect their lives, that decisions are made by the people closest to and most affected by those issues. When we're talking about an unwieldy, sometimes unyielding hierarchical structure, a governance structure buttressed over thousands of years, how do we ensure that decisions are made as close as possible to those who are impacted by them?
I think this is an issue that doesn't just impact on the church. My background is health, and it's about engagement of patients at their point of care. How do, as any institution, actually focus on the needs of the people that are most concerned? I don't think there's any quick answer to actually to changing to a model that operates from a principle of subsidiarity, but I think that there is a willingness to engage, not universally consistent across the church, but I do believe that that it is there. And I think that that's actually been helped by Francis's pontificate.
I think it's a really interesting question, though, isn't it, Helen? Because, and I'll put this question to our panel later, so much of that depends on the willingness of those who are in power at the time. So this idea of subsidiarity, which is a really rich and important principle, is not necessarily baked into the church's governance structures. It's possible where there's willingness for that to happen.
And unwillingness.
Yes, exactly. My point exactly. It depends on.
Yes, that's certainly true. But I think we're a human organisation. We're moving from a structure that focused on top-down control to now one where we're looking at more engagement of the laity, and indeed even some of the clergy and religious institutes. So it's about actually reframing the culture or the mindset of everyone within the church. And that was my impetus to move to the idea of looking at conversion. How can we actually accompany people on a personal a communal, an ecclesial, and an ecological conversion. So I don't think it's going to happen overnight, but I think that there is a willingness to try.
I don't know that anything's ever happened overnight in the church, Helen. Not since the manger in Bethlehem. The last ivity is one we touched on last night, and that's inclusivity. How to listen to, dialogue with, and discern the needs of those at the periphery, those who are underrepresented and marginalised in the church's governance institutions. And of course, as it turns out, that's well over 50% of the population. Talk to me about inclusivity and how that's possible when the governance institutions themselves don't include currently many, many people who are concerned.
I don't think it's impossible to actually consider the needs of groups that are not actually sitting at the table. And it's one of the things that I think that we're very fortunate in our society at the moment, in Australia's society at the moment, is there are many ways of actually influencing decisions, talking to people, encouraging support. I think our Aboriginal brothers and sisters are good examples to us about how to listen to and move in relation to the issues that are crucial to them. I mean, I'm blown away by the process that they undertook to get to the Uluru Statement of the Heart. It was an inclusive journey, it was a synodal journey, it was participatory. And I think that there are instances within our church where that's happening. In our own diocese, we are trying to actually involve as many people as possible in the consideration of how to renew the church in the Diocese of Maitland Newcastle. It's up and down. We don't reach everybody, but there is at least a willingness. And I see that in our clergy as well as in the laity. So I don't think it's an either or. I'm reminded of a friend in the diocese who talks about it's both and. So, and I think that that's, which is, you know, that's actually being an impetus for me to rethink how, instead of being rabid about having a voice heard, is to think about different ways of influencing.
You sound to be positive, Helen. Is that your feeling about the Plenary Council and its deliberations? Do you approach this with a mood of optimism?
Yes, somebody asked me at the beginning how I was feeling about the Assembly, and I said hopeful. And you'd have to be hopeful, otherwise you wouldn't have actually agreed to actually go on the journey. But then made the point, asked me at the end. So what I find really interesting is there is frustration and there is some impatience at the pace with which we are moving. But there's a great deal of passion. There's a great deal of commitment. The issues that we thought weren't going to actually be raised are being raised. And there is respectful conversation around those issues. There are also diverse views, and that diversity is coming out. But it's just absolutely amazing to me is how we can gather with 270 odd members and we can talk to each other in a way that I think is positive, hopeful, and hopefully will actually come out with some concrete proposals and outcomes. So yes, I am positive, and I hope to remain so.
And we hope that you do as well, Helen. Thank you so much for your time. Wonderful to have you there. Let's move now to our panel. This evening, my guests are Peter Johnstone, who's the co-convener of the Australasian Coalition for Catholic Church Reform and someone who gave public evidence on church governance to the Royal Commission on Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse, and Mary Coloe, a presentation sister who holds a doctorate in theology and is a professor within the University of Divinity, and for 7 years worked on a dialogue for the Pontifical Council for Christian Unity. Mary, I'm going to begin with you. Tradition's a great favourite in some quarters of the church, But the governance model we've inherited is not so much Holy Writ as Holy Roman Empire. So a top-down, strongly gendered, hierarchical organisation with military roots. What do you say are the governance responsibilities of the lot of us, of all of the baptised?
You're right on, Genevieve, because when I think of governance, I think we have to start with the responsibilities of the baptised, that all of us participate in the priestly, prophetic and royal offices of Christ, and we need to take that seriously. What is it that we are anointed to by baptism? What's our mission? In other words, looking at governance, don't start from the top based on, as you said, a preconceived model of the Holy Roman Empire. Tim Costello's homily on Sunday clearly stated the vision of the Church rooted in Vatican II's theology, a biblical model, the people of God, not a Holy Roman Empire. So that's what we need to be looking at. Yes, we have inherited a hierarchical model going back to Constantine in the 4th century. And from this time onwards, that top-down model has governed how the church has operated. Leaders are appointed from on high, rather than being called forth from the local group. Leaders are accountable upwards, but not to the local group who they lead. Leaders can be audited from above, but with no sense of transparency to a group being led. One thing about a top-down model is it is very efficient, but it doesn't come from a vision of service. It doesn't come from a gospel vision, not the vision of Jesus of being a shepherd, nourishing, gathering, caring for the needs of the group. The top-down model can very quickly become about status, politics, ambition. In his writings, Pope Francis has called on principles to shape the church. Helen's already mentioned a few of those: subsidiarity, stewardship, synodality. One of the things I was disappointed today, I'm not a member of the Plenary Council, but today I was able to watch some of the live streaming, and immediately what was very visible were roles and status, and that disappointed me. I would have liked everyone to be present as the baptised people of God, calling each other by their baptismal name, just Susan, Tim, Frank, Joan, Mark, leaving the titles and the habits, my word, the habits I saw today, leaving the regalias of office, leave them at the door. We want the Plenary Council to just be people of God meeting, to be as simple as we can. And I think that's a fairly simple step to take to be truly synodal and not hierarchical. I think both in that wonderful statement on church governance, Light from the Southern Cross, I think that those words, the words of Pope Francis, we have the words, but we're not acting on them. We now need to put those words into action. And I'd start just by looking at how the Plenary Council members, how do they address each other? Do they insist on titles? Do they insist on regalias of office? Why can't they just be the baptised people of God meeting to look at, listen to the Spirit speaking? That's my starting point, Genevieve.
Peter, on that, just continuing, one of the themes that's come up about all of the baptised, all of those for whom the church speaks, is the issues around women in the church. You've got a really robust, practical idea to address complete equality on that basis, proposed to the Pope that as a first and immediate step, he appoint progressive women to head up half of the Vatican Curia dicasteries, the departmental secretaries in Australian public service terms. Tell me more.
Oh, that's some things that seem radical in the church, of course, Genevieve, are nothing but ordinary in everyday life. I mean, really, we're talking about a situation where the church needs to catch up with the world. I mean, I've run many organisations. I wouldn't dream of running an organisation without having gender balance at the most senior level. And I know from experience how much difference it makes. But also it's a question of equality. And I state that as strongly as possible, quite apart from any issue of discrimination, any issue of the benefits of gender balance. We're talking about men and women, one in Christ Jesus, to quote the title of that report that has never been implemented by the Australian Church. I mean, the church is too good at often using the language and not walking the talk. So the notion of the Pope appointing women to half the dicastery is simply based on a theory that I've always followed, and most people in management in organisations follow, that you actually need to force change. And I mean, I always had a habit in selecting senior people to say to them, hey, fellas, go out there and get me a short list. And I'm telling you now, if you don't have half women, I'm going to tell you to go back and find them because they're out there. And they'd go back and find them, and then I'd take a decision. So there's nothing really extraordinary about this, and that's the most important thing to say. We've grown up as Catholics having to break through that notion that there was something terrible about women being priests. It seemed odd because we were actually enculturated that way. Most of us these days have grown up in the world, and we realise that women are simply equal. Our marriages are based on equal relationships. I've got 4 daughters, for heaven's sake. I wouldn't dare tell them that they weren't equal. And that's the way they've been brought up, of course, like anyone else has brought up their daughters. So it would make a considerable difference in the church if, in fact, half the women heading dicasteries are women, and then I'd expect the heads of dicasteries to do the same thing down through the dicasteries. And that changes the culture of decision-making. And the culture of decision-making at present in the church is all male, because the real decisions are taken from the top up, from the top down, and imposed on people with very little subsidiarity or synodality. And they're taken by people who are men, and they are celibate men. Now, a lot of very good men, and I want to be very clear on that, but I wouldn't like to be in that situation of having no relationships with women as such and being expected to take decisions affecting a whole society, half of whom are women. So it doesn't make sense, and we need some radical change.
And Mary Coloe, I see you nodding vigorously. And Paul's not too bad on this notion of subsidiarity and governance. And he says now there are a variety of gifts for the same Spirit, varieties of service, the same Lord. Most of us are very familiar with how the rest of that goes. If we're talking about all having a responsibility, all the baptised, and being responsible for everyone in turn, that must call into question whether you can simply ignore the gifts and talents of a great big chunk of the community.
Exactly, Genevieve. See, governance isn't the main focus. What the focus is, the mission. And governance is meant to support the mission. It's a structure. We shouldn't be too much focused on it. It's the mission that's the focus. And Paul, as you say, lots of gifts. So I think we need to start with the community. What are the people? Who are the people we've got? What do they need? And if we think of the parish, the local group, as a gathering of people, look at what they need. And who do we have in the community with the gifts, the skills, the education to respond to those needs? A Eucharistic leader is one need. But I don't see that this person, one person, can be the sole repository of the Holy Spirit. The parish leader could be someone with good skills as a facilitator and a leader. We now might have somebody with financial skills, someone able to reach out and form a women's group or a men's shed or a youth centre. And I think many of these roles could be commissioned at the start of a year. A question that I have, do these tasks require a person to be full-time and permanent? We may have people feeling themselves permanently called to be of service to the community. And I think then we could acknowledge that. Anointing, call them deacons, as they were in the early church, men and women. I'm not saying priests here, because if I look back to the New Testament as a guide, there are no priests in the New Testament. There is Eucharist, but there is no ordained priesthood. That comes later. It develops. So the community that we see in the New Testament looks at the community, what are the needs? And so the community ought to be calling forth the people it needs, authorising them, commissioning them for their mission. So I think we have models that we could draw on.
Well, it strikes me as you're talking, Mary, that anyone who's a graduate of the Institute of Company Directors knows that diversity on boards is an important principle for harnessing the gifts of all those involved. Two quick questions, one for each of you. Peter, we've touched on synodality and subsidiarity as the keys to good governance. What about a truly representative, gender-balanced diocesan pastoral council in every diocese with an active role to provide advice to the bishop on all the matters of concern of the faithful, perhaps a biannual diocesan synod? It strikes me, and this is your suggestion, this would work brilliantly with some bishops and be an utter failure with others, because again, governance rests wholly in the hands of the ordained.
Genevieve, there's actually a provision in Canon Law that diocesan bishops should establish diocesan pastoral councils insofar as pastoral circumstances suggest. There has never been any suggestion from any bishop in Australia that I'm aware of that they had pastoral circumstances that suggested a diocesan pastoral council was inappropriate. However, can I make a general point here? There's a lot of difficulty here for the bishops. The bishops, to some extent, have a conflict in looking at this whole matter. They have not been formed to be leaders that are participative. Now, this is just a simple fact, without any criticism. They are given autocratic powers. And when you're an autocrat without accountability, it's a much easier life. I mean, what you say actually goes. The trouble is, that goes back to this point of efficiency that I think Mary made, that you might be efficient. I even doubt that. You certainly won't be effective because your decisions will not be informed by the knowledge of the people around you. And I would defy any leader, and you mentioned the Institute of Company Directors, Genevieve, any leader to take decisions without informing themselves as to the thinking of the stakeholders. No one in a CEO position ever believes that they have all the knowledge. In fact, my attitude has always been that if I look good, that must be the people around me doing a lot of good things. And I took recruitment of senior officers very seriously because that's how you have an efficient mob. Can I just make a point? Synodality was first spoken about by Pius XI in, I think it was 1930, and he used strong language. He said, it is an injustice, a grave evil, and a disturbance of right order for a larger and higher organisation to arrogate to itself functions which can be performed at a lower level. And that is simply good management, good governance, but the point I'd make is it is Christian governance, because that's how you achieve mission. And a lot of bishops have said unfortunate things about governance not being mission. Governance is what facilitates mission. Without good and responsible governance, you will not achieve your mission. And I have to say, that's part of the problem in the church today. As a church, we are failing because of our dysfunctional governance.
Well, indeed, I have a good friend who says that poor governance is the root of all evil. And I think that's exactly the point you're making. Mary, just quickly and finally to you, you call into question really whether governance in church matters is essentially linked to ordination. Now, canon law it's a system. It's a system where the ordained take precedence. It's not a matter of revelation. His Holiness the Pope does not speak ex cathedra on organisational principles. So these are things that are fungible, they're changeable.
Yep, that's right. So yes, I mean, at the moment, canon law does restrict governance within the church to ordination. And it's not. Why is that an essential why is that essentially part of governance, ordination? And it fails to recognise the skills, the education of the non-ordained. And I just want to give you two examples, Genevieve. A canon lawyer who works on a marriage tribunal but can't make a decision. She can only recommend because she's not ordained. And so her canonical assessment doesn't count. It cannot be decisive. A husband and wife couple who were the only Eucharistic ministers travelling from Cairns to the Gulf of Carpentaria. Just think of that distance. It took months. They crossed the Cape York Peninsula. Why is their ministry not called diaconate or priesthood? You know, they are the ones bringing the Eucharist, nourishing the people of God in those far-flung places. My example is I have a passion for teaching and sharing scripture. I give workshops to help young ordained men learn skills in preaching. I'm not allowed to preach. I'm not able to open the Word of God in Eucharist. And I think that's nonsense. This is a skill and a passion that could be of service to God's people. So don't deify canon law. It's not divine law, it's human. It's not infallible or unchangeable.
Very wonderful to hear that stirring call from you. Peter Johnstone, some marvellously robust practical ideas. Thank you both so much. Let's move now to your questions via our moderator. Andrea Dean is with us this evening. She's President of Women in the Australian Church and formerly worked in national offices for lay pastoral ministry and the participation of women. Take it away, Andrea.
Thanks, Genevieve. Thanks, everybody. A great discussion tonight. It was a thrill to hear you all. So some of the questions that have come in through the Q&A are practical and some of them are a little bit more philosophical. So Helen, I wonder if I could ask you, based on your experience in the Maitland Diocese, where I believe you have had diocesan pastoral councils, is that true?
It is true.
So what, yeah, sure.
Sorry, and our diocesan pastoral council is called a council for mission.
Okay, fantastic. Lovely. Yeah, lovely enhancement of the term there. So what difference does it make in a diocese when there is a functioning diocesan pastoral council?
I think actually it sends a really clear message that the diocese is trying to actually, to use Peter's term, walk the talk. The Pastoral Council is quite a large body because when it was being constituted, it was a body that was designed to actually represent the diverse interests and the diverse people of the diocese. So that was a really clear message in terms of trying to establish that council. The other thing that I think has been really important in our diocese is a decision was made to have a synod. And we embarked on, a synodal journey 30 odd years ago, and this is the latest, latest sessions of synod. COVID has played havoc with us. So we've had two sessions of synod. The first was basically a celebratory exercise where anybody in the diocese could come. And at that stage, we were really assisted by the thematic papers that had been released by the Plenary Council process. So they became the focus of discussion, workshopping and discussion. And that was very fruitful. We had over 400 people come to that day, which I think is pretty remarkable. So that was the start of this particular session of synod. We've moved to a second session, which was about establishing a spiritual framework. The next session will be about how we actually achieve that. And we're trying to do this in tandem with the Plenary Council. There are frustrations. It would be unusual if there were no frustrations, but I think it is a visible sign in our diocese that we are trying to do things differently. We are trying to walk a synodal path. And that's a very strong emphasis. It's about synodality, walking together, listening to the anxieties, the griefs, the yearnings of the population within the diocese. And I would love to see that replicated across Australia.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you. Peter, I might go to you because I know you've got a passion for diocesan pastoral councils. What's the reason that you can discern behind so many dioceses not having a diocesan pastoral council?
Yes, I was inferring a reason earlier, Andrew, in answer to another question. I think we've got to face up to the fact that a lot of the bishops are not selected under the criteria of canon law with regard to leadership and management experience. And in fact, if I can tell a story, there's a certain bishop I know who had a discussion with at a conference once after I'd raised some questions at the conference. There were a number of bishops there. And I said to them, why don't you all have diocesan pastoral councils? Why don't you have synods? And he came up to me at morning tea afterwards. He started to say, oh, you don't understand. I said, well, actually, I think I do. And he softened up. He said, look, I come from an Anglican background. I understand synods. You've got to understand that most of my fellow bishops really are wary of dealing with their people. They're not sure how to deal with their people. Now, I'm not saying that in any way offensively. It came from a bishop. But I think it's a reality when people who are priests who are selected to be bishops are selected on a whole range of bases. And one of the first ones, as the Royal Commission was told, was that they stick to church doctrine completely. And in fact, I can't think of his name, but that priest from America who gave evidence to the Royal Commission was asked by the chairman, what would be the sort of thing that would cut somebody out? He said, oh, if they didn't believe in the church's teaching on contraception, we'd throw their application out. They wouldn't go any further. So there is a process, a filtering process that pretty much ensures, and can I again point out, the first filter is they've got to be male. And they're male, whether they're A-types or whatever, but who actually are given autocratic powers and told they have autocratic powers. So to then have a diocesan pastoral council can take a little bit of courage and preparedness to give it a go and to realise and to respect the sensus fidelium of the people, the sense of faith. And of course, that's what the Plenary Council is about. And hopefully the bishops will listen to that sense of faith of the faithful that is coming through. And it's already come through in a large extent that's not adequately represented in the papers, but the research has indicated the thing that concerned every diocese across Australia was proper inclusion. So you've got to have a diocesan pastoral council, though. It must be representative. It must be involved in planning. It must be involved in developing a strategic plan for the diocese. It must be involved in looking at the reports, and it must be involved in advising the bishop on things such as reporting to the ad limina in Rome.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Helen. Great to have those dimensions made more explicit there about diocesan pastoral councils. Mary, if we could go to you now, people in their questions have acknowledged really the critical need for change around governance. Somebody used the phrase there that really there's been obscene management, particularly around the church's response to the child sexual abuse crisis and the abuse of women in the church. So given your solid grounding in scripture, what tips would you have for initiating a cultural change in the church? I know that's massive, but what would you say? What would you say as some tips for how to set about starting this cultural change?
Andrea, we have to have women moved into governance. And at the moment, Canon Law prevents that from happening because women are not ordained, women aren't deacons. There's no reason why women cannot be deacons. I would go further and say cannot be ordained to priesthood, but certainly there is the historical and liturgical evidence that women held these roles in the church at least for 600 years. And then I think because of Greek influence, I'm talking the philosophy of Aristotle particularly, downgraded women's value. It's not a biblical value. It's really Aristotle. But once that crept in and we became very, very influenced by Greek philosophy, we lose touch with our biblical roots. So I'd like to see much more education of all people using Zoom to get people much more familiar with the scriptures, with the New Testament, with the Old Testament, and Zoom makes that possible. You know, I could teach 800 people sitting here at my desk talking to them, as I do on, you know, some nights I talk to people in Hong Kong, Brisbane, Melbourne. There's no limit to the educational possibilities if the bishops would do it. Just back it and let people like me let us loose instead of, you know, tying us up and saying no, you're not a male, no, can't have you, don't go near an altar, Mary. That's silly. That's silly. And the sadness for me, Andrea, is that the people of God are starving. That's the real tragedy in this, that the people are hungering for Eucharist, are hungering to be nourished by the Word. And because we have a male-only priesthood, that hunger is being denied. Better to have male priests and a church without Eucharist than dare bring in women. I think that's sinful. People need Eucharist, they need to be fed. And the bishops will be held accountable. They will be held accountable. Read Ezekiel 34. Read what Ezekiel says about the shepherds who did not feed the hungry, who did not seek out the lost. You know, there is accountability.
Thank you, Mary. I love what you've said there, and really you've half answered another question which has come through about, like, how and where can people of faith find the formation that is necessary to be part of this change of culture? I think you've half answered that, but is there anything else you'd like to say?
Well, a number of the colleges of education, for example, I'm at Yarra Theological Union, also Catholic Theological College in Melbourne, Sydney College of Divinity. We offer short-term, like 5 weeks, don't have to do assignments, join by Zoom. So at YTU, we run sessions on the Advent readings, on the Lenten readings. We've just finished a 4-week series on dangerous women in our history, looking at women in the Old, in the New Testament, in history. So these are available. So tune into some of those websites so you know about them. That would be the biggest thing, Andrea.
Thank you, Mary. I know that you've already been very generous with sharing material that you've written or recording yourself. So I think you'll probably get some calls after tonight. And I note too, Mary, that the use of technology has enabled you to preach. And that was a wonderful sermon you gave last week for Australian Women Preach. Thank you.
Thank you.
Peter, just maybe a quick one, if I can, to you. So if you could arrange for women to be more involved in governance in the church in Australia, I know you've talked about at the level of the Vatican, where and how could more women be involved in governance within the church in Australia?
Well, I certainly said, it seems to me diocese and pastoral councils are a given in canon law already.
Yes.
But it's not just a matter of setting up one structure. It's a matter of everything that goes with it and respecting what's involved. I mean, you'd never set up a DPC without gender balance. I mean, that just goes without saying. In fact, the majority of women would be a good idea, considering that the bishop will always be a male. But I do put it in the context of the universal church, because I think we can fiddle around the edges in Australia. We're talking about a universal church, and things have to change. In fact, if I may say, Andrew, one of the things that worries me most about the Plenary Council is that every so often there's a suggestion the bishops won't do anything that they can't legislate on in Australia. In other words, they won't do anything that's governed by the Universal Church as a whole. Now, one point I'd make very strongly is bishops must accept that they pass on to the Holy See the sense of faith of the Australian faithful. They cannot just make recommendations for changes to legislation in Australia. Synodality means the top being informed, everyone at every level being informed by those closer to the real world. It is pointless for any country to have a plenary council or a synod without passing that information upwards. That is the real meaning of both synodality and subsidiarity, and besides which, it's good Christian leadership.
Thank you, Peter. Great note to end on. And of course, it would have been lovely to go on longer, but let's hand back now to Genevieve for a wrap up on tonight's session.
Thank you so much, Andrea, and thank you to all our guests, to Mary and Peter and to Helen. Tomorrow night, we'll be talking about the church in the public sphere. How should it respond to major issues and controversies in contemporary Australia? We'll be joined by Plenary Council member Nippy Kandapa and by Fatima Measham and by Father Frank Brennan. Thank you all very much indeed for your time tonight. I look forward to seeing you at 7:30.